Welcome to BIA Media, your provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the Black community in Ottawa has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our fourth session of our course, Sheroes of Resistance, the Women Who Fought Back, which deals with African women as resistance leaders throughout history. So we're in session 4 in today's course. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about African women as resistance leaders during the period of enslavement. We'll be talking about the period of enslavement this week and next week as well. We started a little bit last week. Last week, we discussed how we can't understand enslavement without understanding the political and economic and social dynamics of Africa itself at the time, how that interaction with the Europeans created the situation that would lead to the resistance against enslavement. Last week, we spent most of our time in Central Africa, in Angola, and the Kingdom of Congo. And we talked about women such as Queen Njenga. We talked about women such as the leader of the Antonia movement, Kimpa Vita, who used spiritual resistance. We talked about in the 20th century, Deolinda Rodriguez, in the same region of Angola, fighting against Portuguese enslavement first and then colonization. We talked about this insidious relationship between African elites that seek to exploit folks, not all African elites, but the African elites that live their life off of exploitation of the African masses, and their collaboration with external forces, the European forces in this case, but also Arab, we'll talk about that. We've talked about that, and we'll talk about it again today. External forces who want to exploit African labor and resources. Well, we're going to continue that discussion today. But our focus is going to be what happened when African women, in collaboration with African men, fought against a system of enslavement in the Americas. And today's focus is going to be primarily on South America and the Caribbean. We'll talk a lot more about North America next week when we talk about folks like Harriet Tubman and others. We might talk about Mary Bibb and a couple other folks in the Canadian experience as well. So that's what we'll get into this week. So we're going to talk about how did Akan women and other women, because we're going to be jumping back and forth between the continent and the Americas. We're going to talk about women from the Akan cultural region, which is Ghana, modern day Ghana, really. We're going to Togo a little bit. We're going to talk about Central Africa again. We're going to spend a lot of time in Angola and Congo and move over. And we're also going to talk briefly about possibly Southwest Nigeria, some Yoruba resistance as well. But we might save that until next week. We have a lot of women to mention today, so please take notes. Please use our course website to get the evidence and background information on the women that we're going to talk about. There's a lot of new readings, a lot of new book chapters, articles where you can get more in-depth information about all the stories and all the figures that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about quite a few. We do have to end, though, around 12:15. I have a mentorship meeting, so I might go kind of fast today, but as always, utilize the course website to get more information. So our evidence today, what are we relying on to reconstruct this history? We are going to be relying on Spanish, French, and English colonial sources and trial records. Because we're going to be talking a lot about rebellions today, when enslaved Africans rebelled against the system of enslavement. Whenever that happened, there usually was a trial afterwards to figure out what happened, and the whites were trying to figure out how do we stop this from happening again. So there's a lot of records that give us a lot of information about the role of African women in these rebellions as leaders, as resistance fighters, as spiritualists, as healers, so many different forms of resistance. We're also going to talk about oral history, Jamaican Maroon oral history, Haitian oral history, African American, Ghanaian oral history. That also gives us information about more information that we don't find in the written record about what these women did and their roles. Because we know sometimes the written record can be clouded by European patriarchy, who don't understand what is meant by these women being rulers. And they write certain things in their language that will present these women as if they're out of their mind, or will present these women as if they're sorcerers or these types of things. But they don't understand that these are scientists, particularly when we talk about Nanny. These are scientists, these are spiritualists. So we'll talk about that. But these are our sources. And the course website that we have includes a number of these primary sources, these written records, but it also includes a lot of secondary sources, scholars that have studied this time period throughout, from Brazil to Colombia to Venezuela to North America and throughout the Caribbean, who have written books and articles and have done documentaries about this type of resistance. So please utilize that course website and pass it on others. It's completely free, and we put it together for you all to have the information. I want to actually start up north, here in Canada, and talk about an important book that I recommend everybody read. It was done by one of the great Afro-Canadian scholars, Afua Cooper, who's out of Halifax, I believe. I think she's still in Halifax. But Dr. Afua Cooper wrote this book a couple of years ago, maybe about a decade ago, called The Hanging of Angelique, Canadian Slavery and the Burning of Montreal. Angelique was an enslaved African woman from probably the region that we talked about last week. Probably was born in Angola or Congo, that region. She was enslaved in Portugal, then brought over to the Americas, enslaved in New York, I believe New York State, if not New York City, and then ultimately brought to Montreal. What Angelique represents and what this masterful text will display to you is the everyday resistance of so many of our ancestors whose names that we'll never know. The people in our families, the women that sustained African families and populations throughout this period of enslavement. These millions of African women resisted throughout the entire period. Now we're going to talk about some incredible examples of resistance leaders that, picked up guns or axes or machetes and fought against the slave master and formed these free African communities. But for the most part, the vast majority of African men and women resisted through everyday acts of resistance, the way Angelique did. Acts of resistance such as working slow, feigning illness, running away for a short amount of time, something that in the scholarship is called petit maroonage, or running away for a little bit of time and then coming back to either the plantation or to the house or to wherever the person was enslaved. Africans would show that you may think of me as chattel or as property, but I'm human. So if I feel like walking off the job, I will walk off the job and do what I do, and I'll come back. You had African women that would use their tongues as resistance. They would talk back to their mistresses and to their masters. You had all of these things, keeping your culture intact, speaking your own language to your children, telling stories from Africa, keeping spiritual practices from Africa, even if they had to be hidden underneath Euro-Christian practices. All of these are acts of resistance that many of our ancestors, most of our ancestors engaged in on a day-to-day basis. They might not have had the opportunity to abscond into an area to form a maroon community where they could live completely free. In Canada, it wasn't practical for that to happen. So you don't have a lot of maroon communities in Canada. But that doesn't mean people didn't resist. They resisted the same way Angelique resisted. Africans resisted by just simply maintaining their humanity in the face of a system that sought to make them animals. The entire system of enslavement, from the time that you were captured, you were marched to the coast of Africa, you were put in a slave dungeon, waiting for the ships, waiting to be boarded on the ships, when you were stuffed, crammed on those ships, and then brought to the Americas and sold on an auction block and sent to a plantation or to the big house or to a mine, because a lot of enslaved Africans were involved in mining or any of those things. That whole process was designed to dehumanize you, to change your name, to brand you with a hot iron, to treat you as if you were property and cattle. But by Africans saying, no matter what's done to me, I know I am still a human being. I'm still part of a community. I will form new communities. That's all resistance. And Angelique exemplifies this. In this story of Angelique, she's enslaved in Montreal. She resists by forming relationships with men. Some were free, some were enslaved, to show that even though I'm enslaved, I can still love, I can still form families. She showed resistance by verbally attacking her mistress when she realized that they were going to renege on a promise. It was believed that the man that owned Angelique, when he died, that she would be giving her freedom. That was the understanding. See, a lot of enslaved Africans, they knew that they were in a condition of enslavement, but there were still some, because they saw themselves as human, there's some negotiation that could happen. So a lot of enslaved Africans worked with the idea of, one day I'm going to be free. So in the case of Angelique, somehow it was understood that when her master died, that she would be given her freedom. But when that guy died, the wife reneged on the issue, and she became incredibly unruly. She became unenslavable, in fact. Sometimes she'd work, sometimes she wouldn't. She would cuss out the mistress and do all these things, and the mistress is just losing her mind. Like, I can't control this African woman. At some point, there's a small fire that breaks out in the house, and Angelique is blamed for the fire. Eventually, though, Angelique practices petite maroonage, and she runs off, but she eventually comes back. And then at some point in the game, a fire breaks out, and then that fire spreads, and it basically burns down all of Montreal. And the residents blame Angelique because she had set a fire earlier, some years earlier. So Angelique denied, and I will never say that Angelique burnt down old Montreal as an act of resistance. I'll never say that because she never said that she did. It was only under extreme torture, that she was forced to confess to starting the fire that burnt down Montreal. So I'll never put that on her because she never said that she did that until after she was tortured. But all the way up until that point, all those various acts of resistance are why she should be honored and why we should honor all of our ancestors that had to go through this horrific time period of enslavement. Because the men and women whose names that we don't know but whose blood runs through our veins need to be honored for their everyday acts of resistance. The fact that we're here talking about that, talking about what they went through, and we haven't disappeared and we're still fighting and we're still struggling with settler colony is something that deserves applause and praise and constant reflection. So keep that in mind. So get this book, The Hanging of Angelique by Afua Cooper. It's a great read. It also will tell you about the role slavery played in Canada's early development. Because a lot of people still have it in their mind that, oh, slavery in Canada was just negligible, it wasn't that big of a thing, and then ultimately you got emancipated, and then it became the Underground Railroad place, and that's what we learned about Canada. No, you need to read this book to understand Canada's role in not just slavery in the territory of Canada, but Canada's role in the whole triangular trade between the Americas, Africa, Europe, all of that. Canada played a key role in that process. So very important read. All right, but today's focus, we're going to go south. We're going to talk about the Caribbean, and we're going to talk about South America, with the exception of Brazil, because we talked a lot about Brazil last week when we talked about the quilombos of Brazil and their connection to Angola and Congo. So we're going to spend actually a lot of time today talking about Colombia. Because when we look at the statistics and we look at current demographics, if we look at the Americas, three countries are the top three countries for Afro-descendant people in terms of population. Number one is Brazil. Brazil by far. I mean, when we look at all the countries in the African world, is Nigeria and Brazil. If we talk about the number of African people, Afro-descendant people in the country, Nigeria is number one, Brazil is number two. In the Americas, however, Brazil is number one, the United States is number two, and number three is actually Colombia. Colombia has the third most amount of Afro-descendant people in the Americas. It's a huge area for that enslaved people were transported to. And if we're going to talk about the African history in the Americas, you can't leave Colombia out because it's incredibly important. It's one of the earliest places that Africans were enslaved. Of course, the earliest being the Caribbean, and particularly the island of Hispaniola, so what's now Haiti and Dominican Republic. It's the earliest place. But as the Spanish, continued their process of settler colonial domination, so they embark in the Caribbean, and then they start making their way out of the Caribbean. We talked about last week, 1526, where the Africans and the indigenous people in South Carolina destroyed Spanish plans for a colony there immediately. As soon as they landed, they, engaged in revolt. But as they start making their way to Cuba, and then you get Pizarro's expedition into the Andes, into South America. You get Cortez in Mexico. With all of these conquistadors, there were Africans, both enslaved and some free, that were involved in these expeditions. And once these lands were seized from the indigenous people, that's when you start to get the importation of African labor into these areas, in Mexico, in Colombia, in Venezuela, in what would become Panama, and all these different places. So let's zoom out a little bit, and we can see where these Africans are coming from. We talked about what was going on in Angola and Congo last week. We're going to talk about today what was going on in what's now Ghana, but the Gold Coast, and what was happening in the Senegambia, and how these millions of Africans ended up in places like Brazil, and Ecuador, and Colombia, and Venezuela, so on and so forth. And how they maintained their cultural understandings, their politics, and various things that they brought with them from the continent as they're into these new realities. Because you have to understand, when these Africans make this transition across the Atlantic Ocean, across the Middle Passage, and they disembark in the Americas, they're like many of us. I'm talking about us in terms of folks that are in Canada, in the United States. You have to make community. You have to make community with folks that in Africa you may have had nothing to do with. You are now in Colombia, a completely alien place, and you may be from Angola, and the person next to you that's on the auction block is from the Senegambia. That's as far away as basically Mexico and Brazil. You don't speak the same language, you don't practice the same religion, you have different ways of politically organizing, but you're both in this situation of racialized enslavement. So out of that, you have to form community. You have to figure out how you interact with each other, figure out what you believe in, what I believe in, how we're going to get free, because the thing that we both want is self-determination and freedom. So how can we work together to achieve that? How do we take the best from our nations, the best political setups, the best spiritual practices, and how do we forge that into a new identity in this hell on earth for a lot of places that we're going into? So this is this type of thing that was happening, and African women played a key role in this. Now, another demographic thing that we have to discuss when we talk about the forced migration of Africans this way to the West, most of this trade was African men. Most were men that went this way. When we talk about the trade of Africans that went east, we're talking about the Arab-controlled slave trade that went off the east coast of Africa through the Sahara or through the Nile Valley. Most of those Africans were women. So there's a gendered nature to both of these trades. The trade east was primarily, the men were used for military purposes, to serve in the armies of the Ottomans and Arab armies, and even further east, even as far east as Japan, you had an African that's a samurai. So there's a lot of military enslavement of African men going this way. But by far, the largest number of people going that way were African women that were used for sex slavery. And even a lot of the African men that went this way were also tangentially attached to that sex slavery because they were going to be transformed into eunuchs. These were men that would be castrated, and they would be put in charge of overseeing the harems. So these are these huge areas in Arab households and in Asian households where African women and other women are there in sex slavery, essentially. They use cute words like concubinage and that type of thing, but it's sex slavery. So the men would be put in charge of security of those harems. And they would be castrated, so the thinking being that they can't be sexually involved with these women, and then they would secure those areas. So the eunuch was a key figure in Arab and Asian politics, because that position would ultimately become one where these men, even though that they were castrated out, they didn't lose their humanity, and they were able to use their position to become power brokers among the Ottomans, in Iran, in India, in various places. So that whole slave trade to the east, it's a little bit different than what we're seeing happening in the West. The West, most enslaved people are coming to work on plantations, sugar, coffee, cotton, tobacco, that type of thing. Also in mining operations in South America and in the Caribbean. So you have a lot of gold and silver in these areas. So Africans are there as mining in mining operations. And of course, the Europeans knew if they could mine gold in Africa, then they had those techniques that could be used in the Americas. So Europeans didn't just take Africans not knowing what type of skills that they had. So farming, mining, of course, domestic servitude, all of those things are what Africans are being used for because of the heavy lifting that needed to be done after these territories were taken from the indigenous population, the clearing of forests for farmland, the mining operations. You needed more men than you needed women. So that's why we have these two different types of demographics for both of these slave trades that are happening. Way more people are going this way than going this way, but this one lasts for a longer period of time. It's actually still going on. If we look at what's happening in the UAE, some of these other places, but that's another discussion for another time. All right, so one of the news sources that I want to alert you all to when we talk about the African experience in Colombia, a relatively new book called Orality, Identity, and Resistance in Palenque, Colombia, an interdisciplinary approach by Schwelger, Kirshen, and Maliga. And this is an edited text, so there's a number of authors that talk about it. And a couple of key words here. Palenque. Palenque. When you see this word, Palenque, Palenque is what they call in many of the Spanish-speaking areas what we would know as maroon communities, or quilombos, or mucambos. So here are some key words that you should write down or remember orally. They all mean the same thing, essentially. The first one we'll stick with is quilombo, because that's probably, out of the four terms, two of them are African, two of them are not. Quilombo. Quilombo is a Central African term. It's a Kimbundu term, meaning war camp. So when those Africans that were fighting in those wars in Angola and in Congo and those places, and they made their way to the Americas like we talked about last week, they were still fighting. So they took the term that they would use for a war camp in Central Africa and made that the name of what they were doing in the Americas. They were forming quilombos, and they would become known as quilombolas, particularly in Brazil, where the language was able to maintain itself. So quilombo, quilombo. A smaller version of a quilombo. So if you think of a quilombo as a city or a province, a smaller version of that, more on a neighborhood level, would be a mucambo, a hideout, a mucambo. Again, from the same Central African region, but it's a smaller version of a quilombo. So one might have thousands of people, one might have a few dozen people. That's a mucambo. Both meaning the same, just to levels of degrees. When the Spanish observed this phenomena of Africans absconding from plantations, absconding from mines, absconding from wherever they were enslaved in urban areas, and going out into mountains or going out into other areas, even forming relationships with indigenous people, the Spanish called them cimarrones, or runaways. This has a connection actually to cattle, so like runaway cattle. So cimarrones. That would become maroon. So in some Spanish areas, they would call these territories maroon communities, and that would bleed over into the English, particularly in Jamaica. Jamaica starts off as a Spanish colony, and then eventually the English take control of it, but they keep that term for these independent African communities that exist in the hills, that exist in inaccessible areas, and that are vicious at defending their freedom. So that's how we get the word maroon, from the Spanish cimarron. But in other Spanish areas, like Colombia, like Venezuela, they call them palenques. It's the same term. But I mean, it's the same phenomena, but just a different term. And I have to look up, and I'll be able to tell you next week, the etymology of palenque. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if it has indigenous aspects to it, but this is the term that they use most frequently in Colombia, and then also, I think, in Venezuela as well. Palenque, Palenque. All four of these things mean the same thing. Independent communities of Africans that have absconded out of slavery, formed their own communities, and they defend them. So the Palenques and the people that live in them are called Palenqueras or Palenqueros. These are the folks that live in the Palenques. And the descendants of these people are still around. Descendants of the and they're still called Palenqueras. And we'll talk about one in a second. But this text, Palenque, Maroons and Castas in Colombia's Caribbean regions. Social Relations in the 17th Century by Maria Cristina Navarrete. Very important text, relatively new text. And what I like about this work, it shows you exactly what was going on in Colombia with the social dynamics. Where you have these Africans that are coming from Angola, that are coming from Ghana, that are coming from the Senegambia, that are coming from Congo, and they're all put together and trying to form these communities. And at times, just like now, we can't, put rose-eyed glasses on the past and think that, oh, they just did this easily. No, there were rivalries, there were differences, but through that process, they were able to form these communities. There were even rivalries between the Africans that were born in Colombia and those that came over from the continent, the ones that were called Bozales. These are the ones that were born on the continent versus the ones that were Ladinos, the ones that were born in enslavement or born in Colombia or born in the Palenques. So you had these dynamics, but out of them, out of that tension, came new understandings of freedom. And this article breaks that down masterfully. In Colombia today, you will see this statue. This is a monument to the Palenqueras, to the women that were in these communities. And this is a map of Colombia, so you can kind of see the interesting area that Colombia covers, because part of it is on the Caribbean side, and then part of it is on the Pacific Ocean. So even with that little slight geographic difference, the development of these Palenques looks a little different. The ones on the Caribbean look a little bit different from the ones that are on the Pacific. These Palenques have relationships with the indigenous populations. Sometimes they were cordial, and sometimes they were, at odds. And a lot of that had to do with the Europeans. The Spanish would put the indigenous people against the Africans, and the Africans against the indigenous people. And then sometimes the Africans and indigenous people realized what was going on, and then they would team up. So you have these social dynamics that are constantly in flux, depending on what's happening and who's in power and what's going on. So this is a monument that if you go to, I think it's in Cartagena today. The book talks about the importance of women to these Palenques. And the women, not just their presence, but also as leaders. And this short passage gives us a lot of information. And so I want to read this, and then we'll talk about this. And this happens around in the 17th century, so 1600s. The arrival of all these new settlers to Limon brought about behavioral changes for the runaway Creoles and the Maroons as well, for its political structure and social organization. Malimbas and Angolans. So when you see the term Malimbas, Malimbas are people that came from what's now Congo. That was the last port of entry that they see. A lot of Africans, the names of their identities in the Americas were often connected to the last port that they came from in Africa. So we'll talk about Coromantes in a second, and they come from the last major city that they saw in Ghana was Coromantes. So when they come to the Americas, they're known as Coromante Negroes. These are people from the Akan culture region. So when you see Malimba, that was the last port, major port city that they were in before they came to the Americas. So you got Malimbas and Angolans. They provoked Maroons and Creoles to attack the farms to secure more soldiers. So what we're seeing here, new Africans that just came from the continent, that came from Central Africa. So again, this is during the time, right after the time of Queen Njenga, right during the time of King Pavita, where you have all this social conflict that's happening in Congo, in Angola, that's producing these war captives that are being sold to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese are then taking these people and selling them to the Spanish, because the Portuguese actually had papal blessing to control the slave trade. They had what was called the asiento, this license to control slavery in Africa. And so the Portuguese would be supplying the Spanish for their colonies. So these new Africans are coming into these established maroon communities. And they're saying, all right, we run away here, and you guys seem a little complacent. Come on, we got to keep fighting. We got to get more soldiers. We need to defend this place. The same attacks were also aimed at attaining more people to work the fields and an increasing number of women. The Quilombos, the Palenques, they always had a lack of women. Because again, just the numbers, there were more men that were, put in slavery from Africa to the Americas than women. So you had a really, really interesting social phenomenon that emerges in these Quilombos. You had women with multiple husbands, polyandry. So this is one of the cultural adaptations that Africans had to make in their new situation. Because back home on the continent, you had a polygamy. You had men with multiple wives. But because of the demographics and what was going on, in the Quilombos and the Palenques, you had women with multiple husbands. So it's really interesting how Africans adapted that. But they were always looking for more women. So look at the names of these leaders. People like Sebastian Congo. That was his name, because that's where he came from in Africa. Cristobal, Anton, and Francisco Malimba. So they come from the same cultural region. That becomes their last name. They inflicted some sort, so this is the Europeans writing this, that these Africans inflicted some sort of witchcraft on the black Leonor. Leonor was a black woman. Apparently, this was a concoction that made her crazy. Malimbas and Angolans aligned with her, and from that point forward, she began to reign over their Palenque, calling her queen, despite the fact that Francisco Criollo means he was a Creole, so he was born there, continued as captain. Leonor and Captain Francisco Criollo communicate with one another in their own African language. And this all comes from testimony after soldiers that went out to fight against this Palenque came back and talked about what was going on. A lot in this passage. So according to the Europeans, these Africans from the continent took this black woman who was a Creole. So her parents were from the continent, but she was born in Colombia. And they put some type of witchcraft on her. They made her crazy, but yet at the same time, they also made her queen and they followed her. So what's really happening? What's really happening? What really happened was probably this. She was probably initiated as queen. The Africans get to the Quilombo and they realize, wait a minute. Back home on the continent, when we have a nation, when we have a political situation, there is always a person representing the male energy and a person representing female energy. There's always a king and a queen or a queen mother. We can't operate without a queen. We need a queen. We need someone to represent that female energy, that power, as we defend this Quilombo. And I'm assuming that these new Africans, they come in and they're like, oh, y'all got lax. Y'all got comfortable, but you realize that the Spanish are going to keep fighting against you. So you need to make sure that you're in the strongest position possible to defend against the Spanish. And the only way you can do that, is by having a queen. This is how we've organized for generations. This is what we need to have. So they probably chose Leonor because her father was from, or either her father or her mother was from that region of Central Africa, and she could speak the language. You could see their family retained the language. She could speak to, and the captain was Creole too, meaning he was born in Colombia. But their parents retained the African language and they were able to speak it. They made her crazy. A concoction made her crazy. No, what really happened, she got initiated. She probably got mounted by a spirit. She probably got imbued with a spiritual power as a practice of the initiation, and then she becomes queen. Because why would they make her crazy and then follow her? That doesn't even, it doesn't even make sense. They deliberately made her crazy and then they made her queen to follow her. It doesn't add up. But if you're looking at it from an African perspective, it makes perfect sense. She got initiated into this new position of queen, and she probably had leadership capabilities beforehand. They recognize that, and they say, look, yo, you need to be the queen, and we're going to follow you. And this is the political setup that we need to succeed as a Quilombo. We see this again in Colombia with a woman named Polonia. Is another queen of a Palenque in Colombia who fights against the Spanish. And much like someone else that we're going to talk about, the Spanish are forced to sue for peace with her. I don't have a lot of sources on Polonia in English. A lot of them are in Spanish. but she's another person that you should know. Her name was Polonia, 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 another queen. So you got Queen Leonore, you got Queen Polonia. Again, they're representing this African cultural continuity. We got queens and queen mothers back home. We need to do that here to make sure that we can defend what we're defending. I just want to highlight two contemporary examples, and then we'll take a quick break. Cha Dorina Hernandez became, in 2022, she became the first Palenquera member of Congress in Colombia. So she is a descendant of these women that resisted Spanish enslavement and fought against Spanish enslavement in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century until Colombia outlawed slavery. And they still live on the lands that their ancestors had established way back then. Because these Palenques were able to defend their territories, and the Spanish were forced to sue for peace with these communities. And the people still lived there. And subsequent Colombian governments and things have attempted to take their land and do other things, so they're constantly under attack. But they continue to struggle and they continue to fight. And even with the political turmoil in the country, they continue to struggle and organize and fight, and also fight for visibility. She's a success story. She is a congresswoman that maintains that Palenquera identity. The Palenqueras also have their own language, which is studied by linguistics because it has aspects of West African language. Central African languages seems to be its base, so there's some Kikongo words and Kiambundu words, and it's just a very rich language. And of course, there's some Spanish in there as well, but it's its own language. It's not Spanish. It's very much like Patois. Patois is not bad English. It's not English at all. It has some English loan words, but it's not English. Same way Palenquera, same way Haitian Creole. These aren't bad versions of European languages. They're African languages that have European words in them. That's the best way to look at it. So she's a congresswoman. The vice president of Colombia right now, Francia Marquez, she's not a Palenquera, but she's an Afro-descendant woman whose ancestors, I don't think they lived on the Palenques, but she's now the vice president. And she's a staunch defender of Afro-descendant rights and the rights of African people around the world. She's actually recently made a trip to Africa, but she's the first Afro-Colombian Afro-Colombian vice president. And she's someone that you should know right now. She's a freedom fighter. She's an environmentalist. These are two people that are representing that identity well in the 21st century, really living off of the memory of their ancestors. So you should know them. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about what was going on a little bit further north in Africa in the Ashanti Empire, the Ashanti Confederacy, and how that nation's growth led to more of these models of African female leadership making their way into the Americas. We're going to talk about some figures with that. So I'm going to stop for a second and open it up for any questions or comments. Daniel, you can let me know if there's anything in the chat, and folks can raise their hand if there's any questions. Any questions? Daniel, anything in the chat? Excuse me.
No, there's nothing in the chat.
All right. If there's no questions, I'll keep going. I don't see any. All right, we'll keep going. It's fine. Many folks have questions at the end. So now we're going to move up to West Africa. We're going to talk about the Ashanti Kingdom. So while all this stuff is going on in Colombia, in Brazil, and these other places, a new political entity is emerging around what's now Ghana, and it's the Ashanti Confederacy. Prior to this, there was a kingdom called the Shire Kingdom, but the leadership in the Shire becomes incredibly oppressive, and the Ashanti are a small people, not a small people, but they're under the domination of the Shire, until one day Osei Tutu arises, and with his troops, he unites the Ashanti, and he's able to defeat the Shire in 1701, and this uniting of these various Ashanti people emerges the Ashanti Confederacy. a number of symbols emerge in this new political formation. One is the golden stool. So all the leaders of the Ashanti Confederacy, the head leader is called the Asante Hene. The Asante Hene is the king of kings, essentially, and his symbol is a golden stool that he sits on. So you have the Asante Hene, and then you have these other sub-chiefs underneath the Asante Hene. But also, you have the Asante Hima, the queen mother, that sits in her own political power, but is ultimately the person that decides who will be the next Asante Hene. And it's not necessarily the mother of the king. It's usually the king's sister, it could be the king's cousin, it could be the king's aunt, because to be the Asante Hene, you have to be elected by a number of people, and the Queen Mother has the final say. And you have to be related to the previous Asante Hene matrilineally, not patrilineally. Not because you're his son, but because you're related to him through your mother. So it could be your uncle, it could be your cousin, it could be your brother. It's not necessarily father to son. It's usually not, because you have to be related to the matrilineal line. So when this confederacy emerges, and it lasts from 1670 to 1902, and it grows. So from its center, you can see its center in Kumasi, it grows to everything you see in yellow over this time period between the 17th century and the early part of the 20th century. When this happens, particularly during the 18th century, we see a lot of these battles, a lot of these wars to expand the Ashanti Grand Confederacy right on the coast in Elmina, Cape Coast, Christiansburg. These are where the Europeans have set up shop. And when they see all this warfare happening, they're licking their chops because they know if there's warfare, that means there's captives. And if there's captives, that means there's people that can be sold to us, that can be taken to the Americas. So this state building leads to the Europeans making arrangements with certain chiefs on the coast to say, hey, because all the warfare in the interior, any captives that are got, we'll give you top dollar for them, and we will transport them to the Americas. So this is what's happening. And then, of course, when warfare isn't happening, the Europeans are very quick to instigate wars, to get more captives, to sell them to the Americas. So all of this is going on. But at the same time, each sub-region of the Ashanti Confederacy has the same political setup. King, Queen Mother. King, Queen Mother. So when Africans from this cultural context are enslaved and brought to the Americas, they bring these cultural understandings with them. For instance, if we look right now, because this isn't a dead tradition. It's not something that is just a past. There's a Queen Mother right now. There's a Asante Hima right now. Her name is Nana Konadu Yiadom III. So there's been two other Nana Konadus. She's the current sitting Asante Hima. She took over from her mother. Her mother died at 109 years old, and I'm not sure how old she is, but she's up there. And her brother is currently the Asante Hene. So, Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, could you just play the video? I just want to show you how alive this political position, spiritual position, cultural position still is. So, Daniel, if you wouldn't mind playing that video.
Frank Deba. Nanimada and at the end, because any say, Nanima, any one you are, or Mark, 29 or Asante,
You see how she's being carried, and all the people wanting to see her. And these other women are also officials. They're probably from the sub-regions of the Ashanti Confederacy. Other members of the royal family. And that's the Asante Henny. That's the head of the Asante. And if you can make it out, you can see that she's covered in gold, because this is why Ghana was called the Gold Coast. There's a tremendous amount of gold there. So she's covered in gold bracelets and everything. So this is a living political position, social, cultural position, spiritual position that still exists. So we don't think about these things as just past things. She's way more important to us than that lady that died last year, the Queen Elizabeth or something like that. We should know her name before we know her name, or that the new king or whatever. We should know the Asante Henny. We should know these African royal people. Not that I'm necessarily a fan of monarchy. I think it's not the best political situation that you could have. It has a lot of problems, and we'll talk about those problems over the next couple of weeks. But if you're going to know any monarchs, you should know the African ones. Anyway, all right, so the Ashanti Grand Confederacy was spread during this time period, and as a result, the Europeans see this, and they, with their forts that are already established, start to get more and more Coromantee Negroes transported to the Americas. Coromantes is the last major city on the coast that these Africans would see before they were brought to the Americas. So wherever they came from in the hinterland, when they got to this point, they were now known as Coromantes, particularly when they came to the Americas. That, oh, the last port they came from, Coromantee, you're a Coromantee Negro. And what we're going to see, that there's a lot of cultural markers to show if someone came from this region. If you know anything about Akan culture, people have day names. You're named for a day in the week. So if you're born on Monday, you have a certain name. You're born on Tuesday, you're born on Saturday, your name is Kwame, and then there's a female, Ama is the female equivalent to that. So there's only 14 names. There's 7 names for boys, 7 names for girls. So if you look in the records and you see someone has a name like Kojo, or Kwajo, or Kofi, or Kwame, or Ama, or Amina, or Kwamina, or these types of names, you know that they probably came from this region. And what we see in the record is folks that came from this region, just like the ones from Central Africa, they fought, and they fought hard when they got to the Americas. Because remember, they're coming out of a warlike situation of empire building. So if you're captured in war, just because you're captured doesn't mean you're going to stop fighting. You're going to keep fighting. You're going to fight on the boats. You're going to fight in the slave dungeon. You might take a break and you realize, okay, it might not be advantageous for me to fight right now, but as soon as I get the opportunity, I'm going to fight. So when they get to places like Jamaica, when they get to places like Barbados, when they get to places like Demerara, which will become Guyana, when they get to these places, they realize, in Suriname, oh, this might be a good time to fight. And they do so, and they do so effectively. So throughout the history of enslavement, Africans from this region fight everywhere they go. The first Maroon War in Jamaica, Antigua, New York. There's a huge rebellion of what they call the Coromantee Rebellion in New York in 1741, where these Africans burned down New York City. Tacky's Rebellion in Jamaica, Amina's Rebellion in Berbice in Guyana, the second Maroon War in Jamaica, Kwamina's Rebellion in Guyana. You see all of these rebellions that happen led by these Africans from that region of Africa, from what's now Ghana. And what's interesting about many of these rebellions, what we're going to talk about today, is the female leadership the female leadership. Because again, they're coming from a place where if you have an Asante Hini, you have to have an Asante Hima. You have to have a queen mother. Your political situation, your social situation, your military situation is not going to work unless you have both represented. In Barbados, all the way back in the 1600s, 1675, there was a almost rebellion until it got somebody told. But in Barbados, there were 37,000 Africans and 17,000 whites. It was a sugar economy. You know, most of the Africans there were quote unquote Coromantee Negroes. So they were from Ghana. They plotted for years. African men and women met and they plotted for years about what they were going to do. They were going to call for a general uprising. They were going to burn all the cane fields. They were going to slit the master's throat. And then they were going to install one of the Africans named Cuffy. Probably his name is Kofi, as king. And when they say install, that's key because that's the symbol of leadership in Ghana. The stool. This is the throne. So when you see this, and somebody's going to be installed, that means they're keeping African cultural and political symbols and structures alive. So if they're going to install Kofi, more than likely they're also going to have a queen mother. But that probably wasn't important enough to be put in the European record. Because what we know about this is because it was somebody snitched and they had a trial and then all this stuff came out about the plans of what the Africans were going to do. A lot of the studies on this, particularly in Jamaica, come from Dr. Lucille Matherin Marr, who passed away in 2009. She wrote books, a historical study of women in Jamaica and the rebel woman in the British West Indies during slavery. These books will give you a good idea of the role that women played in these rebellions that we're going to discuss. So I always like to shout out that. Probably the biggest example of a powerful woman from this cultural context in the Americas is Nanny of the Maroons. She's the only female national hero of Jamaica, and she represents everything that we're talking about in terms of leadership, in terms of spiritual practices, to a T. So Nanny Maroons probably was enslaved during the period of the Ashanti Empire's rise, when those wars were being fought to establish the Ashanti Confederacy. She probably got caught up in that as a young child and was brought as a captive to Jamaica. She gets to Jamaica, and Jamaica's right at a crossroads itself. And a lot of Africans in Jamaica had taken advantage of the fact that the English and the Spanish were fighting over the colony. So when the two Europeans were fighting each other, many Africans absconded and formed maroon communities. They used the chaos of the fighting to get their own freedom. Nanny comes into this context. She eventually escapes enslavement in Jamaica, off of one of the plantations in Jamaica, and gets to one of these maroon communities. And then throughout the years, Nanny becomes the leader of her community. And she represents these 4 O's that are key to understanding this. Opanyen, Ohima, O's, and Obia. These 4 O's are incredibly important to our story. 2 of them are Akan words, and then O's, and we'll talk about Obia. So, OPN, the respect for elders and the importance of elders. Because when we see Nanny in the historical record, and she's not in a lot of, in terms of the written record, she's there, and we know that she existed, but there's only a few records that talk about her. And we don't meet her until she's well advanced in age, but she's still respected in the leadership position. Why? Because Africans respect elders. The older you get, the more knowledge you're supposed to have. So Nanny was respected as an elder. And OPN elders were viewed as the embodiment of the past, as well as members with the largest store of memories from the past. So an old woman and old man are not people just to be thrown away. They're not people just to be neglected and put in a corner, and they're to be respected, and they hold leadership positions. So Nanny was respected as that, as an elder. Nanny was also an Ohima, a queen mother, essentially. So the Asante Hima is the top queen mother, but beneath her, in every region in the Ashanti Confederacy, there's Ohimas, or these regional queen mothers. Essentially, the role Nanny played was that of a queen mother. The Ohima was one that nominated people for positions. They had their own land. They had their own military forces. Very powerful positions. Nanny represented that as a holdover from Africa. Oaths. Oaths were incredibly important to Nanny's community and to many Quilombos, Mucambos, Palenques, Maroon communities. You couldn't just run up into the community and say, hey, I escaped from slavery, I want to join the community. They weren't secure enough for that. You had to take an oath that you would fight for freedom for this community, that you would never sell out, that you would do the things that would be needed to be done to grow the community and to protect the community. Oaths were incredibly important aspects of organizing among enslaved Africans and among Africans that had liberated themselves from slavery. Even that process of, all right, y'all, we're about to attack the plantation, burn it down, and then go off to the woods. Who's down for this? All right, you're down for it? We need to take an oath on our ancestors and on future generations that we're either going to succeed or we're going to die. There's no in between. Now, if we die, we become ancestors and we continue to fight on another side of existence. But if you betray the oath, that's not just going to affect you, it's going to affect your descendants coming after you. So the oath was incredibly important because it bonded you to your community, it bonded you to your ancestors that came before you, and it bonded you to future generations. And it was usually a ritual involved with it. So oaths were incredibly important. I think we need some more oaths today, you know, because we got a lot of snitches and sellouts and people that, you know, will use their individualism and leave us all behind. So oaths were incredibly important. Last but not least, obia. Obia is a term that when I talk to a lot of people, particularly from the English-speaking Caribbean or other places, and they hear me talk about obia, they start to get scared and things like that because it's been conditioned to believe that obia is something that people use for wicked things. Obia is spiritual science, essentially, is what it is. You can use obia for good or you can use it for bad. These Africans were using it for liberation. They knew that there were things that they could be done spiritually. There are aspects of nature that you can use and mix and create and do things that affect people spiritually and also physically. Key tool used in liberation. It was so effective throughout the Caribbean, throughout South America, throughout North America, that Europeans say, oh, that conjure, that obia, that's the devil. We want you Africans to believe it's the devil because we're tired of you using it against us for liberation. So we're going to make you think that if you use this tool, that you're in league with the devil, even though if anything would be further from the truth. It's just like a gun or a knife. You can use a gun to protect your house and protect your family, or you can use a gun to go rob people. That doesn't make the gun evil. The gun is just a tool. The knife is just a tool. You can use it for liberation, or you can use it for oppression. In the case of obia, Nanny used it for liberation. Nanny was a scientist. If you talk into Maroons, people that are descendants of these communities in Jamaica, they say Nanny was a scientist. Nanny used spirituality as well as natural sciences to fight against the British. Because once her community was established and she's a leader of the community, of course the British wanted to crush her community. So they sent forces out against Nanny. And these were Africans as well as Europeans. And Europeans that forced Africans, and some Africans volunteered to fight in European armies. We still got Africans that fight in European armies and police forces and all that stuff. So they would go and try to attack Nanny's Maroon community. Nanny would use camouflage. Nanny would use hit and run tactics. She would use obia to make things like a pot that looked like it boiled without fire. And when the enemy would come and they were to be examined in this pot, they would get pushed off of cliffs and attacked. All of these different tactics were used. The obia was also used to shore up her forces because they were always fighting against forces that were better armed than them. But the obia and the spiritual practice emboldened them to continue fighting and to fight in order to not be made slaves again and to fight to the death. Because they realized if you die, you just become ancestors. So, you know, fight, die. Never be enslaved again. This is what the type of power that Nanny held and wielded in the struggle against enslavement. So much so that in 1740, the British were forced to sign a peace treaty with Nanny. They couldn't defeat this woman. They couldn't defeat her and her forces. So they had to sign a peace treaty. Now, the British attempted to put in the peace treaty, yeah, you can't let any new Africans come to you. We'll let you all be free. You can't let any new Africans come to your community. If anybody else escapes and makes their way here, you have to return them to us. Now, some of the Maroons did this. Some of the Maroons said, all right, yeah, we're free. If them people didn't want to fight before, we're not going to let them come now. So when people would come, the Maroons would send them back to the British, or they would help the British get people that escaped. Some did that. But the folks under Nanny, they wouldn't. And in fact, the British keep writing that people still keep escaping to where Nanny is. So that was her position. But again, she used all of these tactics in the war. The first Maroon War, again, it lasted for 12 years, 1728 to 1740. This back and forth fighting, and the British could not defeat this woman. She was never put back into slavery. So important figure that we need to talk about. But she was, and she's on the Jamaican money, and again, she's a national hero in Jamaica, so someone you should know. But she wasn't the only one. In Tacky's Rebellion, 1760, about a couple years later, Coromantee led a rebellion on Easter Sunday. They covered several parishes in Jamaica. They killed 60 whites, and this was organized by influential Obeah men and women. Again, women play a key role in these rebellions. Tacky's Rebellion. We go to this rebellion. At the same time that this is happening, the Africans in Kingston have elected a queen, Queen Akua, also called Cuba. And at the meeting, she sat in state under a canopy with a sort of robe on her shoulders and a crown upon her head. Now, if you go back to when we looked at the contemporary pictures of the Asante Hima, she usually sits underneath the canopy. She usually has robes on her shoulders. So this is African cultural continuity. So when the rebellion happens in Jamaica, in Kingston, the Africans say, oh, wait a minute. We're about to fight. We're about to get free. What do we need? We need to elect a queen. We need a queen. We need this position to be held. So they elected a Akua. And they did all the trappings of royalty. And this one was so slick. So when the rebellion was happening, eventually the whites get the upper hand, and they start to put the rebellion down, and they arrest her, and they want to deport her to Cuba. So on the ship, somehow she convinces the ship captain to turn the ship around from Cuba to bring it back to Jamaica. And she gets off, and she continues to fight until she's finally captured and killed fighting in the rebellion. But this is how powerful this woman was, that even when she was about to be deported, she got the ship to turn around, and she continued fighting. So another key person to remember, and this is a good book that you can read about this, called Gold Coast Diaspora, Identity, Culture, and Power by Walter C. Rucker, that tells this story. In Berbice, in what's now Guyana, among the Akan, female counselors served as social critics who helped regulate people's behavior. No doubt drawing on such customs, Amelia Van Halinda and Zelinia, Kofi's sister from the Middle Passage, was said to have counseled him about people's loyalty. This is one of the most important rebellions that you might not have heard of in Berbice. This rebellion happened, and they were actually, the Africans were almost successful. And this could have been another Haiti, but the male leadership of the rebellion allowed the Europeans to negotiate for too long. Because they had basically taken over the entire territory, and they pushed the Europeans to the coast, and then they started negotiating with the Europeans, saying, all right, well, we're going to take over the territory, we might let you stay. And there was this back and forth, and the Europeans were buying for time until eventually they got reinforcements and took the territory back over. But had they not negotiated with them, and maybe somebody had told the Haitian revolutionaries later that you don't negotiate with these people, you just push them out, because this is what happened. But while they were in control of the territory, again, they set up exactly the same political situation. We got male leaders, we have female leaders, and the male leaders have to take the counsel and advice of the female leaders, particularly around loyalty and these different types of things. So, and I love this, that one of them was Kofi's sister from the Middle Passage. That voyage across the Atlantic, if you survived that, and many of the Africans that were put on the ships didn't survive. We know that. So if you survived that hell on earth, that bonded you for life. People would call each other malungos or shipmates, and they became family because you survived that trip. So this woman wasn't his biological sister, but because they went through that experience together, they were bonded and became brother and sister. So when he gets political leadership, she also is in political leadership, essentially serving as a queen mother as well. So you see these cultural carryovers. We're going to stop for today there, and I'll pick up with this next week because I don't want to rush through it. Next week we're going to talk about the female warriors of Dahomey, and we're going to talk about the women of the Haitian Revolution next week because we don't have enough time, so I do have to stop early today, but I want to give that the proper time that it needs. So we're going to talk about that next week. So I'm going to stop there today and open it up for any questions or comments that folks may have before we shut it down for the day. David H., go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for the great lesson. I was just curious if there's any, or are you aware of any communities today that are doing those practices actively in Canada or United States?
Yes. There are some. Not many, but some. And a lot of them have